Bets are on. Will Israel push through to total victory in Gaza and bring every hostage home? Or will another shaky deal derail the war? President Trump calls Netanyahu a war hero as Israel's cabinet backs a full takeover of Gaza City. But fierce opposition is working to tear the plan apart. And in Australia, Knesset member Simcha Rothman is suddenly banned, and even as anti-Semitic attacks spike, sparking a diplomatic firestorm. All this and more on Israel Undiplomatic.
Welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. I'm Mark Regev, and as per usual, I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum.
Hi, Mark. Okay, so the top of the news in Israel is the question of whether a new hostage deal is in the works, a la Steve Witkoff, or if Israel is going to go the full 9 yards and take over Gaza City and try to get all the hostages out that way.
So it's actually interesting because you'll recall it was like 3-4 weeks ago, everyone was upbeat that there was a hostage deal about to happen. And the president himself, President Trump, said it could happen in the next few days. And Netanyahu was upbeat. And the mediators, the Qataris and the Egyptians were all upbeat. And then it didn't happen. And then the Israeli government took a decision that we're going to go into Gaza. We're going to go into Gaza City, and we're going to clean out the last remnants of Hamas's command structure and to finish the job. And the cabinet passed the decision, and then the opposition to the government was against the decision, but the government took the decision to go in and finish the job, so to speak. And then suddenly, in the last few days, Hamas is saying it wants to return to the table and negotiate a hostage deal. And I think there's a connection between the two. And I think logic dictates to see there's a connection between the two. If Hamas believes Israel is serious about finishing the job militarily, that makes Hamas more open maybe to a ceasefire with hostages being released. So there's actually no contradiction. If you want the hostages released, you have to say, I'm willing to go full throttle on taking on Hamas militarily.
Yes, okay, but that leaves the question of whether we're talking about all the hostages. There are 20 live and 30 dead, as far as we know. Okay, hopefully the 20 are still alive. Or Hamas is pulling another stunt. It's saying, okay, we'll give you 10 live hostages, 18 dead ones for a 60-day ceasefire, and then we'll talk about ending the war. Now, this is terrible. Okay, of course we want every hostage brought home. But, right now, the left and the right agree on one thing in Israel, and that is that the deal has to be for all the hostages.
But maybe that's not possible, Ruthie. Maybe if you say all or nothing, you get nothing.
Wait a minute. The left says all the hostages and end the war and leave Hamas in power. Whatever Hamas wants, surrender to Hamas and get all the hostages. There is no such deal on the table, but okay. In left-wing La La Land, that's their fantasy. The right wing says, no. We also want all the hostages because if you leave any in there, they could be in there forever. And that's too risky. And then it risks giving Hamas the choice of a selection of which ones to return. And it enables Hamas to rebuild, to booby-trap the tunnels, to rebuild its arsenal, to recruit new terrorists, etc. So one thing everyone agrees on is all the hostages. But the right wing says, yes, through a victory over Hamas. Now, this is why I just wanted to begin by saying you're absolutely right. Hamas said, uh-oh, now they mean business. We're going to sit down with Witkoff again. But actually, not in order to surrender, lay down its arms, not in order to return all the hostages. No. So President Trump, interestingly, at the beginning of the week, he said the only way to get all the hostages out is through totally defeating Hamas. And I have to say, Netanyahu agrees with that. We all agree with that. And that means that I would say, I think more of the public wants the hostages out with a defeat, a total victory over Hamas, a total defeat of Hamas. That doesn't mean killing every last terrorist. It means completely demilitarizing the terrorist organization.
Can I say, Ruthie, of course, we all want, left, right, center, all want all the hostages out. That's not for debate. The question is, what is possible today? What is practical? And the Witkoff solution, which only gives us half of the live hostages and half of the dead hostages over a 6-week period, if I'm not mistaken.
2
But,
months.
yeah, I think the chance of Hamas voluntarily giving up all the hostages doesn't exist. And as I said a moment ago, I said, if you say all or nothing, you can end with nothing. And I know the hard left says, let's just capitulate to Hamas's demands and we'll get all the hostages out. I think that's an illusion. Okay, I think that Hamas is not going to give up. From Hamas's point of view, the hostages are an asset, right? That's their ability to blackmail Israeli society, and they're not going to give up all the hostages. I think it's an illusion to think that they would. And the right says go for a military solution and you'll get hostages out. And the honest people on the right will say, at the same time, they'll say they know there's a risk because the military operation, there's a risk to our soldiers and to the hostages. Now, what the Witkoff solution says is we don't have a full deal. It's for a limited period of weeks over which there'll be negotiations for a final, if it's possible to find some final deal. But people are very skeptical if that's possible. But you do get half the hostages out. And I return and I say, if getting all the hostages out is a question mark over that, if that's really possible at all, maybe if you can get half of them out, that's a deal worth doing. It's like in traditional Judaism, that, if you save one life, it's like you saved all of humanity. If we can get half the live hostages out, is that not something that should be done?
Ask Prime Minister Netanyahu. He keeps saying no more partial deals. Now, he may say it and not mean it. He may also give in the end because of what you're saying. But that is not what he has said. That's not what the cabinet decided. He said no more partial deals. Okay. And so here's the question. Will he stick to that? We know that some members of his cabinet don't believe him because he's also been a little bit vague. Okay.
Yes.
So this is why everybody is asking, okay, so is he going to do that or not do it? And then it comes to, what you were discussing is, yes, and it puts the hostages at risk if we go into Gaza City. Of course it does. They're at risk anyway. And by the way, if we give in to some new Witkoff deal, it'll happen. Not only, well, you have to remember again and again that there are 20 live hostages. Do you know how many soldiers have been killed trying to get those hostages? So the question is, are the soldiers' lives less important? But that isn't even the discussion right now in the public. Of course, it's a risk. It's a greater risk to Israel to give Hamas any leverage, any decision-making. It wants to release hundreds of bloodthirsty terrorists. Do you realize it's because of a prisoner, a terrorist release deal that October 7th happened in the first place, because Sinwar, who masterminded it, was released among them 1,000 and something for Gilad Shalit. But again, all I'm saying is we cannot afford to put the state of Israel at risk.
Can I say, when you said a moment ago that, we don't know if he means it or not, but Trump said Hamas had to be destroyed and that's the way to get rid of the hostages. And Netanyahu has also said we're going to go full steam ahead and win this war and achieve total victory. So maybe they're saying what they think, but maybe what they're saying is utilitarian. Maybe what they're saying is functional. In other words, they want Hamas to understand that unless they go for a deal now, it's the end of them militarily, that we are willing to put our foot on the accelerator and finish this militarily. I think if there is a chance for a deal, if Witkoff is back, it's because Trump wants him to be back. And I think Netanyahu, as you said, has said he's willing to go full speed ahead and achieve military victory. But as you said correctly, he hasn't closed the option for some sort of limited deal that will get half the hostages out. And I think if Hamas really does accept today what it refused to accept a month ago, which is the Witkoff deal plus minus, yes? I think in that circumstances, Israel would be very in a difficult position to say no. Now, in saying that, I know the downside. I know we'll have to release bloodthirsty terrorists who are sitting in Israeli jails.
That's
I know that Hamas gets a timeout to rest and rebuild and regroup and prepare for the next round. I know the downside, but if there is a serious option to get living hostages out, half of them, that is something that the Israeli government can't just say that's not important.
But the families of the hostages, those who hate the government, and those who actually, right now, all the hostage families are angry at the government, but from different ends of the political spectrum, okay? All of the hostage families are saying, don't do a partial deal. They're all saying it. Again, some of them want to capitulate to Hamas and some want to defeat Hamas. But what they're all saying is, if you make a partial deal, you are sentencing the other 10 hostages and also dead bodies to be there maybe forever, maybe for many years to come. They say it is a selection like the Nazis did. All the hostage families are against what you just said. You said if we can save a life. Now, we all feel that way, but the hostage families are not saying that at all. So the question now is, what will Netanyahu do? Obviously, we have to know what Hamas has actually agreed to.
Which we don't. We don't know.
We don't know
Correct.
100%. We know what's in, reported. But I'll tell you right now, I used to think just like you did. I did also believe, and that was true because there were 251 hostages and now there are 50. So, of course, those deals were good. But now, when we're right down to the wire of very few people, and each individual is so precious, it's just as precious. Each individual is as precious to Hamas. And that is why I have turned against this partial deal business.
Can I say you're correct, and it's obviously true that in a period, if it's 6 or 8 weeks, whatever it is the length of the ceasefire, and the hostages are coming out, it gives Hamas time to rest and regroup and rearm and so forth. But it also gives the IDF time to plan the operation and to prepare our second round. And we know much more today about this sort of fighting than we did when this started. Yes, we've had close to 2 years of combat experience, and there's no doubt we're doing a better job in this sort of difficult tunnel fighting, house-to-house fighting. And so it plays both ways. I think if President Trump wants this Witkoff deal, I think it's very difficult for the Prime Minister to say no. Obviously, he has the right to say no. We're a sovereign, independent country. But I'm saying if someone like President Trump says to him, let's go for the deal, it's difficult for him to say no. I also think it doesn't close his options because, as I said, we can use the 6-week period. We can rest our troops. We can rearm. We can, what's the word? We can do maintenance on all our tanks and things, and we can go in again and go in strong. And the truth is, in a ceasefire period, I mean, everyone's very cynical, me included, about the chances of some overall deal. But there's a lot of today more and more Arab pressure on Hamas that they have to end this. And there's more and more pressure from the people of Gaza on Hamas to end this, right? What is Hamas? They've become a bunch of kamikazes. They can't win this. By continuing to fight, they're just bringing more and more suffering on the people of Gaza. Could this period now, especially since Israel has said after this we go in and it's all out, could this not be a period where maybe a small chance that actually there will be a solution where Hamas leaves? As Netanyahu said recently in an interview, he said if they want to leave voluntarily, that we're open to that.
Oh, it's interesting you mentioned that because do you know that Netanyahu, the government, the Israeli government, has been in touch with various countries about absorbing Gazans who wish to leave, voluntary immigration from Gaza. And do you know that one of our mediators, Egypt, has phoned every single, now I heard one of the Egyptian officials on television saying this, that he has contacted every single one of the governments Israel has contacted and told them, don't you dare take in any Gazans. Okay, that's one mediator, Egypt. How about Qatar, the other mediator who funds, is supports, is Hamas. It is Hamas, and it funds all the protests all over the United States and Europe and universities. So these are our mediators who want this deal. Now, interestingly, Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer was one of the people in the cabinet meeting who said to Netanyahu, um, you know, if we don't get a move on and take over Gaza City and, complete the job, President Trump will lose patience with us. And, I really believe that's true. I know you said if Trump wants this deal, but Trump also said, defeat Hamas. And he also said Netanyahu is a war hero. Those are signals. The signals are do what you have to do, because the minute we sit down for a deal, Hamas has the upper hand. Why? Hamas doesn't need to win. It only needs to survive, even by the skin of its teeth. And that will constitute a victory for Hamas. And we cannot let that happen. And we can't trust those mediators who are actually not on the side of goodness in this scenario.
I once again just repeat the point I made that when Trump says things like that, is it functional? In other words, is it a way of putting pressure on Hamas to get a deal, or is it really to say we have to destroy Hamas? And I think the jury is out on that. I was making a different point about the Hamas leadership going into exile as part of a deal. That's what Netanyahu did. You raised the larger issue of Palestinians who want to leave Gaza being allowed to go to another country to rebuild their lives. And it's the most natural thing. People tend to leave war zones and want to rebuild their lives somewhere else. Literally, millions of people left Syria during the civil war, and they went to, are all over the world.
And Ukraine.
And Ukraine, it's the most natural thing. That people to leave a war zone. And of course, the official Palestinian leadership, both the Hamas leadership and the PA leadership, and much of the Arab League, if we're frank, the public position is, no, you can't leave the land. That's a victory for the terrible Zionists. You have to stay in a war zone. You have to put your life at risk. And here there's just so much hypocrisy. Do you know, anyone who's studied the history of the Arab-Israel conflict knows that when the British were running the show here during the period of the British Mandate before 1948, the Arab nationalist leadership used to complain that Arabs shouldn't sell land to Jews for them to build houses on, to build farms on, to build settlements. That was a crime. And yet we know that same leadership itself was selling land to Jews, right? That's well documented. Arab historians, Jewish historians, other historians all said that at the same time they said don't sell land to Jews, they were selling land to Jews because it was good business for them. It's the same with voluntary repatriation from Gaza. They all stand up and they say, no, it's a sin. We have to stay to the land. People shouldn't leave. And everyone comes to the Israeli government, comes to the Americans, come to some European. Can you get my brother out? Can you get my cousin out? Can you get my family out? Everyone wants, there's the Hebrew word protexia. Everyone who wants to get out gets out. And so what are these people saying? I'm getting my brother out, my sister out, but they can't leave, right? Other people can't leave. And it's such hypocrisy, and it's also amoral. You're saying, I'm forcing you to stay there in Gaza. No one's talking about forcing people out. No one's talking about ethnically cleansing, which what Israel is accused of. We're saying people who voluntarily want to leave should be able to leave a war zone to save their lives so they can rebuild their lives and that of their families. It's the most moral thing. It's the most logical thing. And to be against it is really problematic. But what is the problem with all this is there aren't a lot of countries that want to take Gazans. That's the bottom line. And I know behind the scenes, the American government, the Israeli government have been approaching third countries. So far, if something's happening, it's all very quiet and hush-hush. But that's the problem. The Arab countries don't want the Palestinians. And we've spoken about that in the past, the Gazans, because they saw what Palestinians did in Lebanon and Palestinians in Jordan, where they caused revolution. They ran amok. The Egyptians see the Gazans as the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists. And Europeans and other Westerners are not so happy about accepting Palestinians from Gaza either, for, between you and me, obvious reasons.
And that brings us to Europe. Although I will say, you said the Egyptians don't want them, right? But now the Egyptians don't want them to go to any other country either. It's disgusting. We have a peace treaty with Egypt. It is disgusting that Egypt and Qatar are the mediators in this conflict. But let's talk about Europe. Speaking of disgusting, because if anything encouraged Hamas not to make any deals and not to surrender, it's Europe. Thank you very much. And Australia. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay. The Europeans saying, oh, well, this one's going to recognize Palestinian statehood and that one's going to recognize Palestinian statehood. Emmanuel Macron in France. And we've got Britain and even Germany and all these threats to Israel about this. And the Palestinians are, I hate even calling them Palestinians. Okay, the residents of Gaza and the residents of Judea and Samaria are all thrilled about this. Good. Let's remain intransigent. That's all you got to do. You got to kill Jews, you got to kidnap Jews, and then you get a state or you get recognized by all these enlightened European woke idiots. Do you think that the jihadists aren't laughing at those Europeans who've totally succumbed because they hate Western values? The jihadists hate Western values and they laugh at it, all that woke crap. So you have this situation where Europe is encouraging them. And let me just bring that to Australia, which this week prevented Knesset member Simcha Rothman from taking a trip to Melbourne and Sydney to give support to the Jewish community, which has been suffering massive and dangerous explosions of anti-Semitism, and Albanese said, "No, you're not welcome in our country." This is outrageous.
So I'll get to Australia, which is the country of my birth, in a moment. But I'd like to look at the larger phenomenon globally: Europe, Canada, Australia, all these countries that have been either calling for recognition of Palestinian statehood or, in parallel, also calling for an immediate ceasefire, open parentheses, an immediate ceasefire which leaves Hamas in power in Gaza, in parentheses, right? And here I have to say, I think it's like children throwing a tantrum. Why do I say that? Because you've got the serious negotiations to end the war are being handled by Washington. And the Europeans, let's be frank, and the Australians and the Canadians are irrelevant. It's Trump and his team, Witkoff, together with, the CIA and who else, through the offices of, the mediators, whether it's Qatar or Egypt. That's where the real work is going on. But the most important track is through Washington. That we know. And so if there's a ceasefire in Gaza or not, if there's a political solution to this war or not, that's in the White House. And yet these Europeans look on, and I called it before I think it was 2 weeks ago, I called it the ire of the impotent, because they're not involved in any real way, and they're just putting out words. And in fact, the sad thing is they say they want a ceasefire, but they're actually making a ceasefire more difficult, because if I'm Hamas in Gaza, and I believe there's increasing international pressure on Israel to end the war unilaterally, in other words, to end the war because international pressure, why would I give in? Why would I release a hostage? I would just grit my teeth and say, I hold out for another week, another month, another 2 months. In the end, Israel will be forced by London and Paris and Rome and Berlin to agree to a ceasefire. So actually, the real work is being done by the Americans, and the impotent people who have no real input on anything are only causing problems. They're making the jobs of those who want to try to get a ceasefire more difficult by giving Hamas the illusion that they just have to wait a bit longer and they get all that they want without any concessions whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. You call it the ire of the impotent. I love that. It's also the tyranny of the weak. But you know what? It's powerful. And the Israeli left is in cahoots with them in this respect. All of these people who supposedly want the war to end, what they mean is, those people, the Europeans, they don't mean that. What they mean is they want Israel to lose the war. That's what they mean. And in that respect, when you say they're harming it, no, from their point of view, they're helping it. They want Israel to lose. And may I say that the Israeli protest movement also wants Israel to lose. You can see it in their signs, in their slogans. They say that the Israeli government is a bigger enemy than the external enemies, etc. So what you have here is that this is on purpose. Now you're right that they have no say, and thank God it's the Trump administration in Washington. But you're right, America is the only one that counts. But that's not true culturally and in the context of the media, academia, protesters, etc. In that respect, Europe is actually very powerful, and so is Australia. Those messages are very powerful, even though that's all they have. It also causes divisions in Israel because you can hear protest people who hate the Netanyahu government in Israel saying, "You see what you've done? You've isolated us on the international stage. That's not Netanyahu's fault. That's absurd. It isn't Netanyahu who isolated Israel on the international stage. It's Israel's enemies that isolated Israel on the international stage."
So you talk about the protesters, and I think it's important not to put the protesters all in one group. Okay, there's a group of people out there who really care about the hostages, and rightly or wrongly, they're prioritizing the hostages over everything else. And they're saying, I don't care about the strategic implications. I don't care about anything. There are people in Gaza who are held hostage and they're alive, and we have to do everything possible to get them back. And you can agree with that position or you can disagree with that position. I think we should do a lot, whatever we can to get them back, but I don't think we should commit suicide, yes, in doing so. I mean, we go back to the Gilad Shalit deal. And obviously, we got him back alive, but was that really a victory for Israel? And today, at the time, there was massive support for paying any price to get Gilad Shalit out, just as there's massive support to pay any price to get the hostages, the 20 live hostages and the 30, unfortunately, dead hostages out of Gaza. But so that's a position that you can argue on. There's no doubt also, though, that there are people who just don't like the government and are using it as a vehicle to attack the government. They were part of the protest movement before October 7th. And for them, I think they're protesting for basically to do anything, to end the war. And then, of course, they'll criticize Netanyahu afterwards for ending the war, for not following through on the goals, because it's political. And this is Hamas's hope. Hamas, if they believe that the war is going to end because of international pressure on Israel or of internal pressure of Israelis on the government to end the war prematurely, then why would they ever compromise? And you saw that, 2 weeks ago when they put out those terrible videos, propaganda videos, psychological warfare videos of the hostages that were looking like, they'd just come out of Auschwitz. Yes, that's obviously Hamas is starving them. Obviously Hamas is abusing them, and that was clear in the video. Why did they put those videos out? Because it's psychological warfare. We have to get them out now because they're going to die. That was Hamas's goal. And it's very difficult to watch those videos because those hostages are suffering. Hamas is torturing them psychologically and physically and starving them. And I think we have to be, as Israelis, very aware not to play in the hands of Hamas's psychological warfare. But once again, I think there are a lot of people out there protesting that just care about the hostages. Are there other people who have got a political motivation? Of course there are.
No, of course, but the whole country cares about the hostages, Mark. I can't stand it when, it's like the Peace Now movement. Those people they think they have dibs on caring, on humanitarianism, on wanting peace. It drives me crazy. We all want peace and we all want the hostages home. That's not the argument. The argument is how best to get them home. And you know something? If we do partial deals, what will happen. All Hamas has to do is hold on to one. One. Like Gilad Shalit. All they have to do is hold on to one. And they've won. Do you see? That's my point. And that, I have to say, all the hostage families are aware of that. They've all been saying that. Again, those who hate the government and those who don't hate the government, they've all been saying that. Enough to leave one in there. And Israelis go ballistic. And that's because we're good-hearted. I get why. But as you said, we can't commit suicide. Now let's talk about Australia. I mean, I know you haven't lived in Australia in decades, But it's still, you have family there. You know the Jewish community there. They've been suffering incredible anti-Semitism, and not to allow it. And let me just tell you, do you know what precipitated supposedly his ban from coming to address the Jewish community? According to Albanese, is that Simcha Rothman said, we have to defeat Hamas. It's a terrorist entity. We have to, I mean, he said things that are so mainstream consensus. And if that is considered extreme right wing uh, fanaticism, then Albanese, talk about it. He's the extremist.
So the majority of the Australian Jewish community, and I grew up there, were migrants who came to Australia at the end of the Second World War, survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, mainly from Europe. And that was the community. I remember I went to a Jewish day school in Melbourne, and I remember a lot of my parents actually had a lot of the parents of my friends at school actually had concentration camp tattoos on their arms. And it was very much in the atmosphere, either consciously or subconsciously. And I think a lot of Jews who went to Australia said, where's the furthest space from Europe we can go? Yeah, because Europe was, from their point of view, one big graveyard in 1945. And so they wanted, Australia was far away. And it was a free country and a country of immigration and a country of hope and a country where people could rebuild their lives. Opportunity. And far away from Europe, right? And so I think it was a popular destination for people to go to after the Holocaust. And, Melbourne Jewish community was Polish Jews, and the Sydney community was based on Hungarian Jews. But there were people who fled the death in Europe and wanted to go to the other side of the world and rebuild their lives. And I think the fact that you've seen this upsurge of anti-Semitism in Australia is very troubling. It's very troubling. And I saw, if we go to the politics, Netanyahu's tweet of yesterday or the day before, where he called Albanese weak, and he wouldn't stand up, against the pressure on Israel, and he's not standing up with the Australian Jewish community. I mean, that's very undiplomatic language. Yes, he's obviously going for the jugular. And I saw that comment by Netanyahu was on the front page of all the Australian newspapers. It's very seldom, even when you disagree with another leader, you're usually much more, what's the word? You're much more careful with how you word it. But Netanyahu went straight for it. And I think Netanyahu is, what's the word? Is angry.
Not just that. Our foreign ministry said, really? Okay, we're reciprocating. We're not going to give visas to your officials coming to Israel. This is a big rift. Australia and Israel are traditionally great friends. But let me just point something out to you. I mentioned your family and everything, the Jewish community. I've heard from many, many Australians who've commented. They've commented on our podcast, but also sent us emails that actually Australians tend to be pro-Israel, that it's not true, that Albanese is not representative of that. We know how that can happen. I mean, sometimes your government doesn't represent you, even though it's elected. But I will say one thing. You tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, because we know this from American Jewry, and America and Australia have a lot of similarities. And I would wager that those Jews voted for this guy, voted for Albanese. They won't next time, maybe. But I mean, the point being that Jews always tend to be in Labor, or in America, Democrats. And then and today they're seeing the amount of anti-Semitism emerging from those parties.
So I know people in my own family too who are strong Labour voters and voted for Albanese. I'm not sure most of the Jewish community. It's not like the Americans, where like 80% of the Jewish community voted for the Democratic candidate last time around. Yes, it's not the same in Australia. It's not the same. There's even been criticism that because the community was so much supporting the Liberal Party in Australia is the Conservative Party. Yes?
Right.
They've burnt their bridges with the current government. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things. It's more complicated. It's different. It's
Is
not
it
America.
different in Sydney and Melbourne? The Jewish communities in Sydney and Melbourne?
I think it's Melbourne, as I said, are more Polish Jews and the descendants of, and Sydney's more Hungarian. I'm not sure how that plays out in the politics in Sydney, though. In West Sydney, you've got these swing electorates, these swing seats, which you have a strong Arab Muslim community, and they say that's very important for the government. Obviously, the Muslim Arab community is much larger in Australia than the Jewish community. And
That's why Netanyahu called him weak. He called him weak, meaning you're succumbing to Muslim pressure, I think, is what he meant by weak, because I would have used a much harsher word than weak. He's weak. I can't even, I'm not allowed to say on this podcast the words I would use. But it's appalling. I'm curious to know if any connections you have in Australia, family and friends, if you know whether they have completely had it with the Albanese government.
So it's difficult for me to answer that question, but why are people disappointed? You said it before. Like if Ireland says the most outrageous things and no one, and it's water off a duck's back because Irish have been terrible over the last 20, 30 years the whole time, right? What's disappointing about Australia is Australia has an attitude of friendship towards it for going back years, right?
Exactly.
Even there was once this leader of the Australian Labor Party, which is Albanese's party, Bob Hawke, and he was this great friend of Israel. He was a friend of Golda Meir's, the Labor Party there and the labor movement in Israel. And today it's a very different situation, but it also fits into this new mindset, yes, that sees, for the left, the Palestinian cause is this holy grail, right? If you are left, you are, right? And so if I can be totally cynical, I want to say the following about Australia. Let's say there's a radical left in the Australian Labor Party, right? So they're anti-American, but the government probably in Canberra has enough brains not to fight with America unnecessarily. So they don't go that way. And the left probably has strong attitudes on China, and the government knows on China that's too important. We can't play with that. But on a peripheral issue for Australian national security, like the Middle East, like Israel, like the war in Gaza, it's not central to them. That's where they can pander to the extreme views, that they won't let those extreme views go anywhere on the important stuff. Relations with America, relations with China. But when it comes to, that's where they can let them play. We could say that where the children can run amok, because it's really not crucial to Australia. And of course, for the Australian Jewish community, it's very difficult because for them, it's one of the most important issues, if not the important issue.
So do you believe that the Australian Jewish community is going to turn its back on the Labor Party?
So a lot of it already did, but not all of it. Not all of it.
Naturally, just like American Jews. I don't know what we're going to do with the Jews, but that's a whole different topic,
So maybe we'll discuss that again next week.
I think that would be a good idea.
I look forward to that, Ruthie.
So do I.